I am Zora Brady and I'm a junior. My mother first met Joel back in 2014 when they both had their TEDx talk together, and ever since then, our families have been friends. Ever since I met him, I have known Joel as an artist and a storyteller. Stories are a way to connect across generations. They can unite two people who may have never spoken, and they keep history alive for those who often get overlooked. As Joel said himself at the end of his memoir, Fights, it is that story that will give you insight and empathy. It is that story that will help you understand that kid. Our stories make us human. Understanding our stories make us better. Stories foster compassion, empathy, and understanding. Did you know that when someone is listening to a story, their brainwaves actually sync up with the storyteller? Stories can connect people even down to their brains. Not only do tales connect you with others, they can also help you connect with yourself. They make you look deeper within yourself and examine things you may not have thought about before. Telling stories is so important for history as well. Whether it is something like your family history recited through tales told around the living room, to the stories of those who were not able to write their tales on paper, stories have always been essential to keeping memories alive. And with that, I invite you to listen closely as Joel tells you about some of his stories.
Hi, everybody. It brings me so much joy that I get to introduce you to Joel today. I love that everyone here will be able to get a taste of his wisdom and his humor and his story. There's no doubt in my mind that many of you are going to have some kind of small, at least some small, profound experience today. So, a little bit about my story and my connection with Joel. How do I know him? We met in college. He was my teacher. As you can tell, during that time, I was a young, nerdy art kid, though I looked like I was 30 when I was in college. I don't know why. I was just trying to find my way, figure things out, and during that time, he had just begun publishing his Strange Fruit Tales, and I had the pleasure of being able to take the first iteration of his comic arts class. A lot of you don't know this, but I grew up poor in a very distressing, tumultuous environment. Every bit a first-generation college student, being in school at times felt like somewhere between thriving and surviving. I moved around a lot when I was in school, and you can imagine my coursework would slip up from time to time. When it did, I had a lot of professors that would, lay down the guilt trip. They'd say, "You're not reaching your potential," or "You need to do better." And when they said that, I kept my mouth shut. They didn't know what was going on at home, and I had too much pride to let them in on it. Joel, however, was different. He got it. An unspoken understanding that served to prop me up rather than beat me down. No judgment necessary. I would learn much later in his memoir, Fights, just how much more tumultuous his own upbringing was. So I feel like there's always been a bond there. We were two people trying to climb Maslow's hierarchy of needs, or rather at times it'd feel more like trying to compress that pyramid down so creativity and survival could meet. As a teacher, Joel was very much the guide on the side rather than the sage on the stage. He let me make my own mistakes and provided me resources when needed. He walked the walk of someone who embodied their own creativity as opposed to just talking about being creative. I would go on to graduate, but we kept in touch. I got some freelance illustration work here and there and some small teaching gigs to make ends meet, but teaching wasn't really my goal at the time. I don't know what he saw, but it was Joel who would go on to offer me a chance to teach a college-level design course in his department. I, of course, accepted, and after teaching that class, I was off to the races, and I feel like I found my true calling. So I can say with confidence that if it wasn't for Joel, I wouldn't be here teaching you today. Yeah, I don't know why I include that. Yeah, anyway, missed a slide change there somewhere. I would later move on to teach at other institutions while he did the same. He would eventually land back at his alma mater, Boston University, and become chair of the MFA of Visual Narrative. He would also continue to author the aforementioned memoir Fights, One Boy's Triumph Over Violence, which was cited as one of the best graphic novels of 2020 by the New York Times. He wrote the words and drew the pictures for Fast Enough, Bessie Stringfield's First Ride, the award-winning graphic novel series Strange Fruit, Uncelebrated Narratives from Black History, 3 volumes of Tales of the Talented Tenth, and most recently, he has the forthcoming graphic novel adaptation of Ibram Kendi's New York Times bestseller, Stamped from the Beginning. So yeah, he's been kind of busy, and it's been an unbelievable journey for me to watch. It's been so gratifying to see someone so talented climb that ladder, to see the real deal not just create and survive, but also prosper. He's made it, but every artist, he knows he's got a lot more work to do. The grind doesn't stop. I hope that I've been able to convey at least a little bit of what Joel has done and meant to me. If I could offer you all anything, it's be humble, keep your mind open, and keep your eyes peeled for a mentor. And who knows, with a little bit of luck, that mentor might become your good friend. Ladies and gentlemen, Joel Gill.
I need tissues now. That sucks, Joe. So, I don't give artist talks. Mostly because I think artist talks are boring. How many people have gone to an artist talk and heard somebody say stuff like, I am interested in the conceptual idea of, I don't know, giant words and like BS along the way. So I don't give artist talks anymore because I'm a storyteller. And because I'm a storyteller that tells comics, I like to think of this as like an origin story. Like who I became and how I became who I am, mostly because my path was not specifically straight, right? Like if you think about this idea of like now you guys have the opportunity, if there's a cartoonist in the audience, which I hope that there's like 704, that you have, like you can go to a school where you can study comics and then you can go to grad school at Boston University, and you can study comics again and then go directly into publishing. For me, there was nothing like that. So I ended up going this very circuitous path. And it all starts in 1974, thereabouts, where this lady was walking down the street. And this guy who had just gotten out of the military, serving in the Vietnam War, was driving a very nice car that he had. And as men do, as one of my students always says, men be menning. He sees her on the street and he goes, hey, pretty lady, do you need a lift? And she said, I have a knife, I will cut you. But eventually she does get in the car. And later what she told me was actually she didn't have a knife, that she actually had a gun and threatened to shoot him. So thereabouts 9 or 10 months later, I was born in 1975. And so my dad, whose name was Joe Henry Cabinets, came from a long line of Joe Henrys, like going back to like the 1890s, mostly named after uncles or brothers or something like that. And my dad wanted to call me Joe Henry. And my mom was like, nope, that's a slave's name. And so she said, how about Joel? And he was like, okay, because he just listened to what she said. And then she said, and the doctor was singing Onward Christian Soldiers, so how about Joel Christian? And so that's how I became Joel Christian Gill. Fun fact, my dad's last name was Cabness, but my mom had this complex about all of my brothers and sisters who were from her first marriage, who was named Gill, and she didn't want us all to have different names, so she just gave me her last name. That's how I became Joel Christian Gill. Also, another really fun fact, the song Onward Christian Soldiers is the theme song to the Ku Klux Klan. So we bounced around a lot at this time, and we moved from one place to another place until in 1980, my father passed away under very suspicious circumstances, which you can read about in Fights. My mother and my grandmother passed away over the summer, and she and my mother both think he was murdered, but there was never an investigation. And up until probably like 3 or 4 years ago, this was one of the only pictures I had of me and him together. And as you can imagine, I became a really angry kid. And I had the misfortune of running into Miss Norton, who was my second grade teacher. Now, when I was a kid, like they were in Southwestern Virginia at the time, schools didn't desegregate until like 1972, 73. And so a lot of the teachers that I had in school in 1980 had only been teaching black children for a very short amount of time. Miss Norton was terrible, like absolutely horrible. Hopefully none of the teachers here like Joe are as bad as Miss Norton was. Miss Norton used to pull my hair. She used to make me, I never had recess for like almost the entire year. After like the first month, I didn't have recess because I used to have to stay inside and write on the board. And that I will not sneeze in class was an actual thing that happened. But one of the things that she did was read to us every day. Specifically, she read Tales of the Fourth Grade Nothing. I don't know if you read that, but it's one of my favorite. I actually have the original copy of it in my that I carry around. I used to carry around in my backpack, but now it's in my studio. And it was my favorite part of the day. As you can see, like I'm in the chair. She wouldn't let me sit around there with the table of everybody else. And she also took us to the library. And she said, she would take us to the library and she would say, I got to keep an eye on Joel Gill. And it was great because the library for a poor kid growing up was like going to going to a toy store. So I always say that if Miss Norton is not burning in hell with Ronald Reagan and Rush Limbaugh, it's because she taught us all how to live, she taught me to love books. And in loving those books, I really got a very good sense of how stories work. And I would basically I just read this something most recently, like a book is a movie that you don't have to wait for the ending for because you can just keep reading it, right? And so like that was a thing that I spent every summer. Like they'd have these reading contests and I would just get every single book and I would just carry them down from to the projects that I lived at. I would just carry them down and I would just sit and read. And most of the time I would read comics, but most people when they get into comics, they get into superhero comics. I didn't get into superhero comics initially. I mean, I loved Batman as a kid, even though I have really problems with billionaires who beat up poor people. But I loved Batman at the time. And but for me, it was more about like these stories, like Mad, Highlights, Super Cracked, or Cracked magazines. Mostly because if I bought like a floppy comic, I would read it in like 15 minutes and I'd be done. But if I bought Mad or Highlights or Cracked, it had more stories in it, so it was very economical for me. So I would do these things and I would like really spend my time in these stories. The other thing I got really interested in was He-Man. Now, because people like me have money now, He-Man is coming back because it's a nostalgic thing. But I always tell people He-Man was like the Pokemon of the 1980s because you had to catch them all, right? There was like, and it doesn't make any sense. It was like He-Man would bring a sword to a laser gun fight. I have no idea how this worked. And he would, like, people would be riding horses or mechanical horses or giant cats, anything, right? It was all this stuff. And it came out in 1983. I loved He-Man. But I was poor, so I couldn't actually afford any of the He-Man action figures and toys. I can have them now. I actually have all of this right now in my studio. That's the thing that happens when you're poor and then you're no longer poor. You can just buy all the stuff that you couldn't have when you were a kid. And you would watch these like 80s commercials. They don't have commercials like this now, but the 80s commercials, it would always be like these kids outside in this like dirt pile. And you had all this these levels of stuff, and it was like all this stuff people would be playing with the He-Man action figures. And so we had places like that in Southwestern Virginia, where I grew up. And we would go outside, and people would be like, Joel, where's all your He-Man figures? And I'd be like, they're at my grandma's house, right? They would say, do you have Castle Grayskull? I'm like, yeah, it's at my grandma's house. Everything that I owned was not actually real. It was always this story that I told about who I wanted people to think about who I was. And it was always at my grandma's house. But what's interesting is now that I look back on it, because we've had this like family reunion where all the kids that I grew up in the projects with would get together and have a cookout every year in July. And what I realize now looking back is that all of those kids were telling the exact same stories, that their stuff was at their grandma's house too. And it was at that point, looking back in retrospective, I don't think I knew it at the time, but it was at that point that I think I became a storyteller. So, I'm skipping a lot of stuff here because, like, as you all know, high school sucks. So I'm skipping all of that in middle school and going straight to college. And I did everything the wrong way. I will be married with my wife, and I will be married 28 years next month. But we got married when I was 20 and she was 17. And when I decided, and we had kids right after that. So my kids were born like almost a year later. My daughters were. And so I was like, I need to go to school because I need to take care of kids. And I wanted to draw comics, right? Because I'd been drawing comics as a kid. And so I applied to a lot of the colleges. And the interesting thing about this was I didn't graduate high school. So I went to, I had one credit that I was missing, and they wanted me to come back for an entire year and do study hall for like the entire day. Like, take this one class and do study hall. And I'm like, miss me with that. So I went and got a job at a place called Virginia Plastics, and it was this plastic extruding molding company. You know those plastic poles that go up the side of telephone poles? Anybody ever seen those? I used to make those. Not fun. I do not, 1 star. So I did that, and then I decided to go to college. And so in Virginia, there had been a bunch of like textile mills closing. And so Virginia came up with this idea that if you lost your job and you were 18 and you were living away from your family, then you could go to college without actually having a high school diploma if you took some placement tests. And so I was initiated into that program. I was kind of snuck in. And so I sneak into this program, and they tell me to take some like math classes and some English classes, and I say, I'm not going to do that. I just take the classes. And I gear everything toward as close to comics as I possibly can. So I'm doing a graphic design program because it was the only thing that they could do, and I took a painting class. And painting sidetracked me for like 10 solid years. And so I decided to go, after I get my associate's degree, I decided I'm going to go to college and become a professor, hopefully in painting. So I applied to Roanoke College, where I end up going, and I get a scholarship, I get accepted, and then a week before classes start, they call me up and they say, Joel, we need your high school diploma. And I said, I don't have a high school diploma. I have an associate's degree at this point. And they were like, well, we can't let you in without a high school diploma. And I'm like, well, I don't know what I'm supposed to do. And he was like, well, I can't do a GED class because it was 6 weeks and then you had to take a test. So he was like, why don't you go to the night school, see if they can help you. So they sent me to the night school. The principal of the night school looks at my transcript. I had like a 3.7 or 8 GPA, and he was like, you don't have anything we can give you, so how about we just give you a test? And he goes, how about world history? And I'm like, okay, I'm a historian now, but not 25 years ago. I was not a historian. And so he told me to come back. So like 3 or 4 days later, I come back. My wife was in the car. My twins, who were just turned 27, were in the car. And our neurotic dog was in between them because we couldn't leave the dog anywhere because she would like tear up stuff because she had separation anxiety. And I go and I take this test. My high school English teacher was the proctor for this test. His name was Mr. Powell, and he was like that cool teacher, not the creepy one. You guys know what I'm talking about, like the cool one, like that was actually a genuinely cool person. Mr. Powell was the proctor for the test. So he gives me this test. They didn't give me a study guide, a book, or anything. Just come back and take a test and pay like $35 or something. So I take this test, and Mr. Powell comes back in. He gives me the test back, and he goes, Joel, now that you found some of the wrong answers, let's see if you can find some of the right ones. So he gave me the test again, and so I took it again. Now, this is the point in the hero's journey. You guys know Joseph Campbell's, where I cross the threshold into the abyss, right? I go into the unknown. I've passed the test, and I'm out to go into the world, right? And so he comes back in, and he goes, Joel, do you need to impress Roanoke College, or you just need a diploma? I said, I just need a diploma. And he looks at Mr. Ball, who was the principal at the time. He said, just give him the damn diploma. So that's how I got my high school diploma. And then I guess you can clap. So I went on to become a Virginia Foundation of Independent Scholars school summer scholar, where I did a bunch of paintings on blaxploitation movies. At the time, and then I applied to grad school. And then I got into Boston University. And there I became very insular because I had been studying these, like doing these idea of these paintings about a lynching that happened in southwestern Virginia. And I just got to a place where I couldn't talk about those things anymore. So I just stayed within my circle and just painted my family. These are all my kids. But then when I went back to Virginia, I thought to myself, I need to like revisit this idea because what I discovered by moving from southwestern Virginia, where in 1983, when I was collecting He-Man figures, there was a Klan march in our town, and like I was never afraid to go anywhere. Like there was a place called the Ruetan Club, which we would drive by all the time, and I would ask my mom, what's in the Ruetan Club? She would say, that's where they hold the Klan meetings. Never really afraid of going anywhere in this town, but when I moved to Boston, this bastion of liberalism, I discovered something that I didn't know existed outside above the Mason-Dixon line, which is racism. Did y'all know that racism exists above the Mason-Dixon line too? I don't know, like it was kind of crazy. So this guy told me, place neighborhoods not to go with my white wife, right? Don't go to this neighborhood in Boston, go to this neighborhood. And it really got me thinking about like being a black man who's in love with the South. It's kind of like if you fall in love with like a drug dealer who's like a reformed drug dealer, there's just some things you just don't talk about, right? So that was sort of that's sort of the way I thought about being in love with the South. And so I came back and I started to look at those paintings again, those images of strange fruit, those images of lynchings. And I thought, and I've been listening to Billie Holiday's song Strange Fruit at the time, and I thought it'd be really good to reimagine this idea as like, what would have, how to think about we've come a long way, but we still have a long way to go, right? And so I did this self-portrait, which is called Strange Fruit Harvested. He cut the rope. Basically trying to create the metaphor that that this man who would normally have been lynched has freed himself. But the noose is still there. This is before I actually thought about the idea that the police are doing to black men what lynch mobs did in the 1930s and 40s of the first part of the 20th century. But trying to make a point about how that rope was still there. And a friend of mine from grad school came to the show that I had. It was really successful. I sold a lot of pieces of the work. And a friend of mine came to that show and said, your paintings are trying to tell stories and they're failing, which is not something that you want to hear after you like spend this traumatic amount of time in grad school with 4 kids in a 2-bedroom apartment that's way more expensive and you actually have to go bankruptcy to pay for everything. It's crazy. That's a whole nother story in and of itself. So we left Boston. And I did the series of paintings on strange fruit, and at the same time, I discovered Chris Ware. And Chris Ware is a cartoonist who's won the Guardian Prize for Literature, and he had just done this big book called the Acme Novelty Library Saturday Afternoon Fun Book. And so I did this, I started finding this, and I'm like, these are really interesting. How can I use the language of comics in my paintings and still talk about myself and my family? Because I was thinking about this idea of how I tell my own story, specifically about my father dying. And so I started doing these images called The Fantastic Voyage of St. Joe. Joe was my dad, and my grandmother documented everything. And so she actually went to the place where he drowned, and she took pictures of them pulling him out of the water and everything. So I have all of these pictures of my dad after he had passed away. So I did these images, and they still weren't working. And so I used to draw comics I used to draw caricatures at after proms. And this woman came up to me, the psychic, swear to God, this is exactly what happened. The psychic came up to me and said, thank you. A psychic came up to me, and she was like, when are you going to write a book? And I'm like, I'm not going to write a book. She was like, I think you got at least 2 books in you. And I'm like, that's crazy. I'm not writing a book. So she comes, so I'm drawing caricatures. If you've ever been at a caricature artist stand, you know they draw like all night. So I'm drawing caricatures, and I'm talking to one of the students. I'm like, did you go to that psychic? I'm like, that woman's crazy. She told me to write a book. I was like, ain't nobody got time to write a book. And the student legitimately turned to me and was like, you already drew one tonight. And I'm like, oh, yeah. And so I just started drawing comics. At that point, I started drawing comics, and I started drawing this story called Dandelions, which was a metaphor. It was based on my life, but wasn't actually my life. And so I drew this, and it was about the time I did this, I discovered the Boston Comics Roundtable, which was a group of cartoonists in Boston who all get together and talk about comics. And so I went down there, and I had drawn like 35 or 40 pages of this, and one of my friends, Jesse Lonergan, who is, you guys have probably seen his stuff on Instagram because he's got like 100,000 followers on Instagram, but he does like giant, like a samurai cockatiel or a panda with a jetpack on. He does all these like really incredible images. And Jesse flips through it, and he goes, I'm like 30 pages into this, and I don't know what I'm reading. And so at that point, I'm failing again, right? I'm failing at telling stories. And so I decided to get myself what I call a library degree in comics. And that means what a library degree in comics is you take a library card and you bother the hell out of librarians trying to get as much information as you possibly can about a subject, and you read everything. And so I read everything there was about comics. And I started discovering all these cartoonists, Winsor McKay, who I'm a big fan of, Joe Sacco, who I'm a big fan of. And at the same time, I found this cartoonist named Box Brown, who wrote this book called Andre the Giant. He wrote Cannabis, the Legalization of Weed in America. And Box had, his name is Brian Brown, but he went by Box Brown. So I was cyberstalking him, as you do, right? Cyberstalk people. And so I came up with the story of Henry Box Brown, who was an enslaved African. Fun fact, I never say slave, I always say enslaved person, because slave implies that that's what they were as opposed to something that happened to them, and it puts the onus on the victim as opposed to the oppressor. So I always say enslaved as opposed to slave. So he was an enslaved African who escaped his oppressor by mailing himself in a box from Virginia to Philadelphia. And I thought that was really interesting. Box Brown was a white kid from Philadelphia, and I'm like, so I sent him an email. You're a white kid in Philadelphia. Why do you have the name of this enslaved African? And he goes, that's really funny. My friends I'm square-shaped, so my friends call me Box. He said, but I might draw a story about that guy someday. And I was like, that's an amazing idea. I'm going to steal your idea. So I stole the idea, and I drew the story of Henry Box Brown. And so comics are not like going to a gallery show or anything else like that. It's like you want to sell comics, it's really easy. Start making comics, go to make a copier, get a home printer, make some copies, and then go to a show and start selling it. So that's what I did. But I didn't want to call it the story of Henry Box Brown. So I wanted to figure out how to make my own version of Chris Ware's Acme Novelty Library, which is stories that he just wants to tell. And so I called it Strange Fruit. And I went to a show and I started telling it, and then this amazing thing starts to happen is that people start telling me other obscure African American history stories. They start telling me things like, have you ever heard of Harry Bucky Lou? And I'm like, no. And so I would gather up all the information, that would write down their name, and I'd go to the library. I would bug the hell out of the librarians to find as much information that I possibly could about Harry Bucky Lou, and I found out that he was the first black basketball player who played in a league in Lowell, Massachusetts in 1902. So I drew a story that I would have Strange Fruit 1 and Strange Fruit 2, and that just kept happening until I had more stories. I had the story of, Marshall Taylor, who was called the Black Cyclone, who was the very first African American in America world champion in any sports. He was a cyclist. Teddy Roosevelt was one of his biggest fans. And so by this time I was going to a bunch of different comic conventions, and I was selling these little mini comics that I made until I had my first publisher, Fulcrum Publishing, come by my table just randomly, like luck. Like just happened to walk by my table, bought everything on the table, went back to his room, read it, came back and was like, his name is Jason Rodriguez. He said, my publisher is now getting into like nonfiction comics, you should talk to him. And I'm like, cool, you're gonna pay me for what I'm already doing? Cool. That always do that. If somebody offers you money for something that you're already doing, take it. That's like life advice number one. Take money that people are gonna give you. And I published the book, and then I thought it would be really cool if Professor Gates, who was the head of the Hutchins Center and at Harvard, and does the TV show on PBS called Finding Your Roots. You've probably seen like he told Ben Affleck he had slave parents, and it like broke Ben Affleck. So slave family members. Sent him an email, and he immediately responded that he would write a foreword to the book, which was amazing. And about that time, my publisher was like, we should do more books. He said we should do a number of books. We could do like a series like of just intro biographies of African Americans. We can call it African American Action Heroes. And I said, no, we cannot. I said, how about, I've been reading this essay by W.E.B. Du Bois called The Talented Tenth, or The Problem with the Talented Tenth. And he said, and I said, why don't we call it Tales of the Talented Tenth? And he said, that's a great idea. And so I did a story about Bass Reeves, who was the most successful U.S. Marshal in American history. He caught over 4,000 criminals in the Old West. He didn't know how to read or write, so when he would go out to places, he would memorize the warrants, and then he would leave a calling card behind as a silver token. He would leave a silver coin behind as a token. He would dress in disguises. He only ever killed one person in self-defense. And a lot of historians believe that he is the original inspiration for the superhero, the Lone Ranger. So I did this story, and then this interesting thing happened where I was on a TV show, and this woman was like, why are there no women in your comics? And I'm like, I'm sorry, that's what male privilege is. I didn't think about it. And people just told me these stories, so I just actually drew them. And so as opposed to going down the rabbit hole of like, I'm not misogynist, like it looks misogynistic that I didn't draw any stories about women. And so I immediately start to look for stories of black women, because what I learned is that there are untold narratives, and then there are untold narratives. And those are typically people who are more marginalized, LGBTQIA+, black women, like those are more marginalized people. So I started to reach out for stories about black women, and I found the story of Bessie Stringfield, who was the first woman to crisscross the United States on a motorcycle. And she did this in the 1940s and 50s. When women weren't supposed to do anything, black women weren't supposed to exist, and she was this 5'2" woman riding a Harley all over the place. She used to do these things called penny tours, where she would throw a penny at a map, and wherever the map would land, she would go to it, and if she ran out of money along the way, she would join the circus and perform as the Negro motorcycle queen. She was pretty incredible. There was one thing she said once in an interview. Somebody asked her if she would ever get married. She was married 6 times in her life. If she would ever get married again, and she was in her 70s at this point, she was like, yeah, but not to an old man. Only thing an old man could do is drive me to a young man. That's what she said. By this time, I had done another story, another volume of Strange Fruit. This one has more tales of uncelebrated narratives, including it has stories of women, including the Black Nightingale, which was, they were African-American conjoined twins who basically sang in P.T. Barnum's circus. Cathay Williams, who was the only known female Buffalo Soldier. By then, I wanted to do a story about, I wanted to do some picture books, and it was sort of like a way in which to expand my career. So I pitched a story about Bessie Stringfield as a little girl, mostly because I wanted to draw a little black girl on the cover of a book, picture books. I didn't think there were enough. And so I drew this imaginary story of Bessie Stringfield as a little girl, and these kids in her neighborhood telling her she can't ride her bike. So after that, I felt like I had enough facility to go back to tell my own story. You all may be familiar with the book New Kid by Jerry Craft, who's a friend of mine. And when Jerry was writing his book, he had originally thought about it as being a straight memoir story about his life, because New Kid is based on him. And I had originally thought of Fights as a fictional story based on my life. We both went in opposite directions. And it took a while for me to come to the conclusion about telling the story, because I wanted to tell the story about how I survived the amount of trauma that I had, which was emotional abuse, sexual abuse, and racism, and being in poverty in this small town in southwestern Virginia. And so I thought it was important to tell it from the angle of a real person. Because I wanted people to see this. I always say that Fights is a love letter to kids who grew up like I did, which I think worked, because like Joe said, this was one of the best graphic novels of 2020 according to the New York Times. I won the Cartoonist Studio Prize for it. It's probably one of my most acclaimed books. and I got an Eisner nomination for it. But I didn't win because I was up against Gene Yang. Gene Yang is the LeBron James of comics. He won every category he was in. So, yeah, like I have 4 friends who are up against him. He won every category he's in. And he's got a Disney TV show, and he's a nice guy. So, like, you can't really hate him. I always show this image mostly because it was an accident. This is an image from Dandelions, which was done about 10 or 12 years ago. And then the image on the right is from Fights. And it just snuck in. I didn't even realize that those things happen. So, like, you never know what happens when you're making work, how those things kind of sneak back in. But that image is almost exactly the same. So, and then I went on to do a series, another book. My most recent book was Tales of the Talented Tenth, about Robert Smalls, who was another enslaved African who stole a Confederate warship and sailed it through Confederate waters to the Union. And then in about a 5-year span, he was an enslaved African. He learned to read. He became a businessman, a war hero, a congressman, and then he wrote one of the first laws that funded compulsory education in America. So, like, we have all of these monuments for Confederate traders, but we don't have any monuments to people who actually did things for America, like Robert Smalls. Like, most people can go to school because of Robert Smalls, and not one school in America is named after him. And then most recently, I just finished the National Book Award winning adaptation for Ibram Kendi's Stand from the Beginning, A Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. This is the cover. It just went live on Amazon. But a fun fact about this cover, which I tell everybody that I show, originally I had, the guy in red is Thomas Jefferson, and the guy with the wig on is Cotton Mather. And so on the original version of this, I had Thomas Jefferson praying to Angela Davis, and I had Cotton Mather dead. And they said, Joel, we can't do that on the cover. And I said, well, if you make me redraw it, I'm going to make sure the Confederate flag is on fire. And they were like, fair enough. So the Confederate flag is on fire on this one. And these are some pages. This book will be out in June. And it tells the story of the history of racist ideas in America. And it's interesting that we're talking about this during Martin Luther King's Day, because a lot of people focus on the idea that Dr. King said, that judging you by the content of your character, not the color of your skin. And they use that, and they've twisted his idea to mean a colorblind society, which is very admirable. But a colorblind society is like saying, we don't want to think about color, so you don't want to actually deal with the issues that have been created by what's happening in black and brown communities. Because if you don't think about color, and you think every time you think about color it's race, then you can't really focus on those things. It's kind of like going to a house, going to a neighborhood, and all the houses are on fire, and you're just like, I can't focus on that one house because I have to check all of them first, right? But even though you know the house is on fire, because that would be unfair. But the reason my point in saying that is that the nature of racist ideas are very cyclical, and they just evolve. They just change over time. And the book talks about how those ideas change. If you look at the top left-hand panel, you can see that we had lynching protests, and we had the civil rights movement, and then Black Lives Matter, and then George Floyd. It seems like we're always protesting something because there's something that we're not fixing. We're putting Band-Aid on things. And that these ideas, these racist ideas, are foundational to the idea of how America was built. And this is a close-up of, we went from lynchings, like I said earlier, that, the police are doing to black men what whole groups of people used to do before. So they just basically made it more efficient. Last, I just want to show you, this is my workstation, and it's almost always this messy. Which you can tell, if it's this messy, you can always tell that I'm in the middle of something, because I don't have time to clean it. And you can see there's a page on the Cintiq. I work on a Cintiq and an iPad. I have a lot of different screens. And I'm going to wrap up with this last little bit. So this is how I worked on Stamped. Dr. Kendi gave me a PDF with all of his notes on it for the book. And then I worked in 2 programs to do thumbnails. I worked in 3 programs: Clip Studio Paint, I worked in Procreate, and I worked in this program called Liquitext. And you can see that what's interesting about Liquitext is that, see those gray lines going to the drawings? You can draw and make notes, but you can also link it to the text. So no matter where I am, I can just push those little arrows, and it'll take me back to that text so I can get a good sense of what I'm doing. If you see this little area here that I've circled, I'm just going to take you really quickly through this drawing. And so typically, this thumbnail, what I do is I'll copy that thumbnail and I'll blow that thumbnail up. And then from there, I'll draw a really rough pencil. And I'll only spend a lot of time drawing things that I can't necessarily draw. Like if I think I'm going to have a problem with it later, when I ink it, that's the thing that I'll spend more time on. So you can see that the hand is very, it's like the hand is sort of drawn, but the other hands are not very drawn because I figured I could do those. The building is very detailed as opposed to the body because I could draw the body but not the building. And then from there I would just ink it. And then in the book, one of the things I think is very interesting is whenever there's a racist idea in the book, it shows up as one of these black dripping word balloons to show you a visual key that that's a racist idea. For example, here's one. And I also use the racist caricature of a black person as a stand-in for the N-word. So as opposed to actually saying the N-word, I put that in there so that you get a sense of that. And that's mostly because Chris Ware said once that he wanted every image to be like a hieroglyph that had filled with a lot of information. And so when we see that image, I want you to see that history of those racist ideas and how that's embedded and how even in fights when I use that word, when I spell it out for black people to just say the word that doesn't have that history involved in it, it's kind of like telling a joke in a room where everybody knows that the joke is wrong. Do you know what I mean? Like if we're all in a room and I tell you something that we have the same value system and I tell you that joke, then you all go, yeah, that joke is funny, right? But if I tell that room, even if it's a dark humor, right? Even if it's dark, and if I tell that joke in a room full of people who believe those things, then that becomes a very dangerous idea. And so that's what I'm trying to do with these images. So, in conclusion, stay in school, I guess. But I think it's most important just to wrap this up is to just say my entire career has been about telling stories. And like Zora said in the beginning, stories connect us. And what's interesting about how they connect us is that the first time you ever meet someone, in your first interaction, you tell a story. You tell a story about your life. And you tell these little bits and pieces of yourself, like what kind of coffee you like, what kind of TV shows you like, what's your favorite this, if it's sports or anything. You just tell a little story about yourself. And that little story is really important because most people don't understand that little story is what builds a connection. And that connection builds humanity. And while we tell stories, we are building humanity. We are telling people the story. I'm telling people the story of these African Americans who are Americans, and these stories don't happen anywhere else. And these stories are important because they help to build that connection. And that connection is really important because it builds humanity. And if, for nothing else, hug somebody because it always helps too. Thank you. So if you I was trying to cut it off because I know I only had a certain amount of time. So if you guys have any questions, I'd be happy to answer any question you might have. But just as a preface, I am a professor. So being a professor means that if you ask me a question, I can talk for a half an hour. So I just want to put that out there into the world. Does anybody have any questions? Yes. That's a good question. There's a lot. And I'm forgetting everybody's names now, but there was an enslaved African. Her name was Elizabeth. I can't think of her last name. but she was a spy for the Union Army. And so what happens is that her family, who were abolitionists in Richmond, Virginia, when they acquired the groups of people, it was specifically a woman, they actually freed them and sent her to school. So she goes to school in Philadelphia and she comes back. And this woman who had sent her to school was a white woman who people thought was crazy. And she played into that. And she played into that to basically create a spy ring. And so they end up selling this woman, whose name I forget, Elizabeth, into the Confederate White House. And so she is in the Confederate White House. And because they did not believe that black people should be paid attention to, she was basically in the room when they were planning stuff. And so she was using that information to sneak the information to the Union Army. And some people, so if you read the history of the Civil War, there are a lot of historians believe that it was great generals that actually changed it, but there are also some historians who believe that there was a series of African-American spies who were in Confederate places at the time that were actually just telling information, and that was the great turning point in the war. I forgot her name. That's what it was. I forgot her name, and that's why I can't talk for 30 minutes about that. Any other questions? Yes.
Do your kids give you feedback on your writing, and have they ever played a role in what you end up writing?
Not really. It's really funny. Like I was on TV recently on this TV show out of Boston, and like I told my kids, and they were like, "Okay." It's like Dad is on TV again. Like they never pay attention. My mom was on the cover of the Union Leader yesterday, and they were all like excited. Grandma's on the cover of the Union Leader, and I'm like, I've been in the New York Times. They don't care. When they were little, they read the comics because I tried to write them for like an all ages sort of audience, as opposed to what I used to tell people originally is that I wrote the stories for hipsters, right? Hipsters will spend $10 for avocado on toast, right? They'll buy these stories about like these interesting African-American history stories, right? Fun fact, a group of hipsters is called a podcast. I made that joke up. That's why I always tell it. That's my joke. But I did a book signing in Maine after A Strange Fruit first came out. It was my first book signing, and I go to this book signing, and when I decided I was going to be a painter, I was like, I'm going to do paintings that are going to make people cry, right? That's what I want to do. I want to be like that person that people stand in front of the painting and cry. And so I'm doing this thing, and I'm talking about the books, and I'm like, oh, comics are like these interesting stories. Like, they're important stories, but, it's like stories for hipsters, avocado on toast, right? And so I'm telling these stories, and this guy comes up to me, and he's crying, and he was like, thank you for telling these important stories. And it was like, it dawned on me how important these stories were, and it made me start thinking about that because I wanted the stories to be resonant with like my kids reading the story and go, oh, that's really cool, to my grandmother who used to take my books with her when she had dialysis. She would take the books with her when she would read and while she was getting dialysis. And so like that's the age. My grandmother was 90. So like kids to 90 is what I was looking for. Yes?
Okay, so Reformed hipster checking in. I'm a little sore about the But no, I just have a two-part question. So maybe you can talk a little bit about any sort of either racist or ignorant pushback or comments that you have gotten after you published some of your work, and how you pass that and keep going and keep pursuing the ideas that you have and putting this content out there in the face.
Okay, so that's a really good question. I mean, a really good question, and it's something that I think about a lot. Because having to wipe myself off the internet, like I can have social media, but I can't be on those sites where you can like reach out. Like, those sites where you can go if like you're looking for like an ex-boyfriend or something, you can like go on that site to find their telephone number. Like I have to make sure you can pay like $5. I had to make sure I'm no longer on those sites. But the first thing is the internet is not real. Let me say this again. The internet is not real life. No one who says terrible things to me online will actually say them to my face. Not because I'm so big or bad, it's just people don't act like that in real life. So that's number one. So that's part of it. So I get lots of hate. Specifically, I do a comic for The Emancipator called Everything's Racist, A Difficult History of Nearly Everything's. And there's a character, it's basically me and this character who looks like he stormed the Capitol, whose name is Snowflake. And so Snowflake comes in, and he's all excited about something, some aspect of something, and I basically disabuse him by telling him the actual history. For example, one of the impetus behind the Second Amendment was not to protect yourself from the government, it was actually to protect the colonial human traffickers, as opposed to founding fathers, from the enslaved Africans. And so in the Federalist Papers, if you guys have read that, there's this argument between Patrick Henry and John Madison about why we need the Bill of Rights. And so Madison thinks that the Constitution is perfect. Patrick Henry is saying in Virginia, he actually says this, in Virginia, black people outnumber, in some places in Virginia, more than 50%. And we need to be able to call up a militia to fight for these people, because this was right after the Haitian Rebellion. And so in the comic, Snowflake comes along, and he's like, we can fight the government now with our AR-15s, because you're bringing a gun to a drone fight, right? So anyway, so I get hate after those things, and I just ignore it because it's not real, and I just keep going. And when I talk to people in like one-on-one on a micro level, it's different. I try to like listen to people and try to understand where they're coming from, because a lot of times what I think is really interesting about people who have these opposing views from me, is not that their opposing views are built in fact. They're actually not rational, and they're built on emotion, right? We actually saw that at January 6th. That was an emotional response that was not rational from people who claim to be rational and realist. And so I try to listen to them and talk to their emotions, just like any therapist will tell you, talk to the emotion and have that conversation. But in reality, like, the internet's just not real. And like, you look at the internet online, like, think about what you post online, right? You don't post like your messy room. You don't post that argument that you had with your parents the day before. You don't post you only post the most amazing things or the coolest things about your life. And so, like, just keep that in mind when you're looking at it. We're legitimately living in this postmodernist idea of the world where everything is made up. We have artificial flavors, reality TV, and this, like, life that people see online, which is not real. It's not real. Everything's made up. Stay woke.